Good morning and welcome to the new edition of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. Few days back, a self-styled think tank in USA called Freedom House projected India as being partly free. Amazingly, it did not mention Pakistan to be partly free. It did not mention China to be partly free. It did not mention Myanmar to be partly free, but India and a few other countries which are either communist or are ruled by the conservatives were called partly free. Now, let's be very clear. Freedom House is funded by Soros, about whom I talked about a week back, how he has declared unequivocally in Davos this year at the World Economic Forum that the government of India, headed by Modi, needs to be removed. So maybe this is another step. Now, the report cites very clearly a multi year pattern in which the Hindu nationalist government and its allies have presided over rising violence and discriminatory policies. And it lists events in 2020, rights, and use of sedition laws against critics, and so on. India was among the 73 countries downgraded for decline in political rights and civil liberties. And when India is downgraded, that means with a huge population, India is once more a small country. Does it look that authoritarian actors are going bolder? If so, yes, India might be. According to the report's author, Sarah Repuki, democracy and pluralism is under assault. The brutality of autocratic regimes and ethical of democratic powers are combining to make the world increasingly hostile. Status change, according to them, explains why Indian democratic society has declined from free to partly free. They're very interesting deductions, and if you really study it, you will find how stupid the report is. It cites now, I'm quoting, a multi year pattern in which the Hindu nationalist government, notice the word Hindu nationalist government, by applying this application and this title, this adjective, the authors of the Freedom House admit that they begin their examination from preconceived standpoint about Modi. These are same group which had objected to Modi being given a visa when he was the chief minister. And it's funded by George Soros, so nothing about that. Even the worst critics cannot accept that the laws passed by the Modi government benefit only the Hindus. Look at the policy of advantage. One section of the Indian population was not enjoying and they're getting it. If you remember, earlier Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had declared very clearly that the Muslims are the first right on Hindus' natural resources. And they had made schemes benefiting only Muslims. So that was not degrading the democracy and freedom in India. But this action, the actions of the Modi, now look at some of the actions which should be called progressive social legislation. Removal of triple talaq. Did it help Hindus? No. Abolishing gay and sex discrimination. Did it benefit only Hindus? No. Right to privacy, firewall, and women being given the equal right to pray in temples and in masjid. Does it only help Hindus? No. So even when the state governments, not the federal government, but the provincial governments, have enacted legislatures impinging on the private lives of the two consenting individuals, the courts have been quick to restrain police. So how is it not a free society where judiciary is free to the extent of being so free that it has a license to do whatever it wants, where all the conversations of people can be aired and the media is anti-government and is not being curbed. So if the institutions are strong, does it mean that now it's not just about the loaded title? The Freedom House's report is, but it is based on the opinion of the observers and external consultants. Now, did they trick Freedom House into concluding? But if they had conducted a basic fact check, they would have realized that CA law basically has nothing to do with the Indian Muslims, the citizens of the country. As a matter of fact, CA is to rescue minority citizens of some Islamic countries where they are being terrorized, harassed, and troubled by the religious fanatics. And it's about helping those minorities. So, how is it against Muslims in India? Secondly, if they had seen and studied the reports or the police records or the court record, they would have seen that there was an equal number of Hindus and Muslims charged for the riots last year. So the equal number are charged. How do you claim that there is partisanship or favoritism of one community? There have been instances where the courts have freed trials rebuking the police for its overreach. Or is it indicative of discrimination against the Muslims? Can anybody respond? And then a methodology relying on observers and external sources can never be sound. And do you know who are those observers? And did they try to find and filter the bias of these observers? Globally, Freedom House and its ratings are being called into question. And one prominent researcher concluded, he's in Oxford University, and I received a message from him that the rating may look scientific, but they are really subjective. In 1970s, Freedom House rating was produced by one single social scientist, and his name was Raymond Geston. And he wrote later on that all his assessments were based on hunches and intuitions. Hunches and institutions, that's the prime source of information. Do the hunches and the institutions imply a serious, objective, scientific study? And the team of analysts and advisors have since taken over Gestel, but the subjectivity lingers on. Recently, an American publication called the National Review concluded that this institution, funded by Soros, is a strong partisan leftist institute, and it is only interested in finding fault and creating fault if none exists. Is USA itself, Israel, Great Britain, Poland, Denmark, they are all, when ruled by the Republicans or the conservatives, are decided and declared to be not being free. Housing rate, Freedom House rating scores, while educating on the traditional divisive issues like immigration, border, security, criminal justice, gender. And if in 2018 the Freedom House reported bias against five nations, that is, Israel, Great Britain, Poland, Denmark, then you can definitely say that its conclusions are fit for the garbage. Unsurprisingly, in the face of mounting scrutiny, Freedom House has taken to admitting that there is an unavoidable subjectivity. Unavoidable subjectivity. Shameful. Now let's come to the seven basic points on which they have condemned India. As I said, the very first is that on the title it's wrong. Number two, it's not based on interviews and research, it's based on the hunches. Thirdly, the social legislation passed by the government is not exclusively for Hindus. Fourthly, there is a free press, very independent, judiciary independent to the extent of being at fault. And elections are fought, performed, which are very honest. Nobody can challenge. Nobody has challenged till now. There might have been some cases, but overall, it's much more honest than those elections in USA. Now, they said discriminatory policy against the Muslims, as we have already said, that 20, and they mentioned to 2020 riots, that both parties, both communities were equally prosecuted. There was no partiality. Proportionate and appropriate action was taken to control the situation, and legal and preventive steps were taken. Then, on the sedition, it's the responsibility of the government when the opposition calls for the division of the country. When the protesters start and go ahead with disrespecting the national flag and destroy the sanctity of the institutes like the Red Fort, have a, and conduct murderous attack on the law and order forces, injuring more than 400 policemen. And then if some people are arrested for sedition, is it wrong? Is it not sedition? But then there's investigation, there's a prosecution, there's a protection of life and property, and there's the responsibility of the state government. Now, thus it referred to the migrants disaster triggered by the lockdowns. The federal government was very clear, and they helped set, even run trains, special trains were run. But then, if that lockdown had not been there, how much coronavirus would have spread in a country, overpopulated country like India? Look at what has happened in USA. So lockdown, and if some people suffered, they did suffer, undeniably. But it's not the fault of the government. They were at one place. Where was the need for them to travel 2,000 kilometers or 3,000 kilometers to go back to their homes? They could have waited for some time. But running away doesn't help. Still, the authorities took action. State disaster response fund was created. Migrant staff was appointed for containment. And are you aware that 1.700,000 crore, that's more than 17 billion rupees, was spent offering free food, free ration, and that was given to the day wages, daily workers, laborers, and so on. There's an objection to human rights organizations that they are being troubled. The Constitution of India provides sufficient safeguards to protect the life, property, and the human rights of the people. And India has already set up not only Human Rights Commission at the federal level, but there are also state level, provincial level Human Rights Commission, and the National Commission is headed by a Supreme Court justice, and it works on a mechanism to inquire, investigate, and make recommendations. Safety of the journalists, they have objected. Now, as far as the debate and concerned, pick up any newspaper, go to any TV, and you would find at least 60% of them are absolutely vocal, even on wrong issues. So that when the government issued a special advisory to the federal, to the provincial governments, directing them that the safety of the journalists was of paramount importance, does it mean that they were being persecuted? Internet shutdown was there, but that was for a short periods. And another such all review orders of the Home Department are reviewed by a review committee, and it's under the chairmanship of the Cabinet Secretary. There was a specific reference to freezing of Amnesty's international property. Now, let's not forget that Amnesty International violated Indian laws. They circumvented Foreign Contribution Act of 2010, by which foreign funds can come, but there's a certain procedure for that. Otherwise, it's a case of money laundering. And Amnesty International was doing that. See, the last time they got permission to get funds was on December 19th, 2000. So after that, 21 years have passed. 21, and they have not asked for the permission, and all the money was coming illegally. So if the government takes action under laws made not by the Modi government, not by the so-called Hindu national government, but by the so-called secular government of Congress, then how is Modi responsible for that? His only fault is that he is implementing the laws. And if that's a crime, yes, he is guilty. The whole report should be read as a fiction which is tilted against the nationalism that's prevalent in India, that is directed against the government of India, which is swearing by and abiding by the Constitution, which misinterprets social legislation, which does not affect one community or another, which is based on conjectures, intuition, preconceived notions, and not on research, not on actual interviews. A report that is basically mischievous, slanted, and is real garbage. Ruskin long back had said there are two types of literature. Literature of the time, all the classics are there. Literature of the hour, like the newspapers. This report is not even the literature of the minute. It is political and social pornography. Let's be very clear. It is not a report. It's a slanderous, scandalous document. And when such reports are issued, which aim at increasing the animosity and divisiveness among the people, then strong action is required. Would the government of USA take action against such think tanks? But then why blame US government? Funded by the same sources like George Soros, the elected president and the vice president today, belong to the same clan as Freedom House does. So the best India can do is to ignore this report with the contempt it deserves and just think it to be a pinprick, which does irritate but has no effect ultimately. Such reports are a curse of so called freedom of press and freedom of expression. Libelous, contemptuous, and absolutely unfit even to be given a time. But then today I gave time to clear the cobwebs, clear the confusion, and show the reality of this ignoble effort of this so called freedom house. Thank you.